I'm pleased today to be able to, first of all, apart from the people here, and I'm going to thank them in a second, but to thank Aviva very much for sponsoring this event. I also want to have a particular thanks to Google and L&G, who also sponsored the overall publication. And amongst the panel, some of whom were on the committee that did this, also Andrew Churchill, I see, who's sitting here, who owns and runs his own company and was part of the panel that looked at this. So on the panel today, obviously we've got the Chancellor here, Philip Hammond, who's agreed to say a few words directly after I've finished. And then we've also got the Dr. Gerard, Lyons, an economist and also former Chief Economic Advisor to the Mayor of London. Also, Mr. Ronan, who's the Managing Director of Google, and Katherine, Chapman, Director of the Living Wage Foundation. I'm going to be asking all of them to say something after the Chancellor has finished speaking, and then we'll take questions. The Chancellor's asked to give his apologies earlier because he will, of course, wait for everybody else to have said what they have to say, and then he's going to have to leave because he's in the middle of preparations for tomorrow's speech. So that, I think, is only fair. Anyway, let me just introduce this paper. I think this is a very important paper, and the reason we did this is not the usual sort of idea that you do a productivity paper because it's a buzz topic to talk about. We decided at the Centre for Social Justice to do a serious in-depth look at what the problem was in the UK, or first of all, if there was a problem, and then what that problem was. Hugely to do with the fact that whenever people write about productivity, they tend to miss out a particular group. And it is the group in the bottom 20% of the income deciles that actually are the ones that are most affected by poor productivity. We wanted to look at how Britain's productivity problem affected them, and also to make recommendations about how overall we can actually improve productivity in the UK, which would lead to increasing and improving incomes. But some of the main bits I'm just going to mention in passing, which are really quite important. The UK's sluggish productivity growth, we found, stems from a very long-term failure, and this isn't just over the last few years, and even doesn't just go to the last recession. It's a long-term failure to realise the potential of the bottom 20%, as I said earlier on. So in other words, not to focus on them has been one of the bigger mistakes. It's left us in a very London and southeast-centric issue here. The second is that the lack of investment that really followed all of this in business, in the long-term lack of educational attainment, have prevented many of those same workers from often moving beyond their normal disadvantaged backgrounds and the low level of income that they make. And that means that they're not harnessing their natural abilities. And that's one of the great failings, and the failure to invest in that has been one of the big issues. The second really area is the overall UK's industry's generally very poor record of investing in not just training, but also in raising the skills and the capability in automation in their plants, has really led to a growing demand for cheap labour to make up for the fact that so many people are less productive as a result of that failure to invest. It's quite interesting to note that even going back to the last recession, one of the things we point out that if productivity growth had continued to progress at its pre-crisis rate, which was still pretty low by comparison, 2 to 3% per annum, rather than today's 0.2%, output per hour would be 20% higher today than it is at the moment. And the CSJ report points out that productivity in the key sectors, such as manufacturing, however, was falling long before the recession in 2009. And so there is a link, as we pointed out, between low skill and low productivity and low attainment. And it's quite worth mentioning something here which is really important. There's also the bigger issue about the regional problem the UK faces. The UK lags behind its neighbours on things like job progression and the way that skilled workers progress from their lower income into middle wages. We have one of the worst records on that. Fewer than 15% of low-wage skilled workers progress to middle wage in the United Kingdom, which compares very badly with places like Sweden, Belgium and Spain even. But also importantly, we have an internal issue, and there's a chart which is worth reading if you see the paper on page 18. And this points out quite categorically that of all of the various regions in the United Kingdom, only 2 rise above the average GVA for the UK. All the rest are below the average GVA. Of course, they are London and the southeast. The east of England just makes it to the mark, but the rest are all below. And interestingly, an average wage for a worker in Yorkshire, somebody working in Yorkshire, the average pay is 75 pence they earn compared to in London where they would earn £1. So 25 pence or 25% worse off in Yorkshire than they would be in London doing the same level job. And it's worth looking at this because this chart alone tells you that it's not just an international issue. This is very much an issue of what has happened by a lack of investment, a lack of training, a lack of valuing of people who work outside of London and the South East. So we have a problem in the sectors and we have a problem in the regions. And all of those are issues that I know the Chancellor will need to address in the course of the next few weeks and months, but very vitally, it is one of the biggest areas that we don't talk enough about and one of the reasons why we need to be able to spread that skill and productivity. So I'm going to finish there. Those are just some highlights. There's an awful lot more to look at. There are a huge number of recommendations made in this paper. But I'm going to ask the Chancellor now to say a few words about the paper, and then I'm going to pass on to the others.
Well, thank you, Iain. And first of all, I should congratulate the Centre for Social Justice in engaging with this issue. It is one of the, I've said this many, many times, I'm like a stuck record on productivity. It is the big long-term challenge facing this country. Our productivity gap with our neighbours in Europe, with the United States, condemns us to long hours and low wages. And we have a coping strategy in the UK. People in this country work incredibly hard to provide a standard of living, but we have to address the poor productivity performance. It's not that we don't know how to do it, because London is one of the most productive cities in Europe and indeed in the world. It's about ensuring that the best practice we have, the highest productivity regions, spread that practice to the rest of the country. And the gap, as Iain has just said, between our best performing citizen regions and our less well performing citizen regions is greater in the UK than in any of the other G7 countries. The gap between the UK and its second and third cities is far higher than the capital city, second, third city gap in any other major developed economy. And the reason I'm particularly pleased that the Centre for Social Justice has tackled this issue is that I have been saying for years now, this is not just an economic problem. Of course, it is an economic problem, how to raise the productivity performance of the UK economy, but it is also at the heart of many of the social justice issues that we face in this country. And Iain has lighted on one of the key questions: where do we go to tackle the productivity conundrum? Do we look at our most productive businesses and try to make them more productive still? Do we look at the cohort, if you like, the 60th to 80th percentile, the cohort just behind the best, and try to raise their game? Or do we go to the other end and focus our attention on those with the lowest productivity performance? So there's a huge range of questions that we have to address as a country. I'd just like to leave you with two specific thoughts. Firstly, that having a big productivity gap is a problem and it is a challenge. But once we unlock that productivity gap, it also becomes a huge potential to us. Once we work out how to tap in to that pool of latent productivity that we're not yet tapping, it becomes a resource that we can deploy to drive growth across our economy. I invite you to think about the Chinese economic miracle, taking 900 million low productivity workers and translating them into the industrial sector to become high productivity workers, has fueled and driven growth in a way that no one could have imagined. We have large numbers of low productivity workers in the UK, and if we can unlock the puzzle, we can see productivity rising, wages rising, living standards rising in this country as we catch up with the higher productivity comparator nations around us. And the final point I will make, and you'd expect me to make this, is that we must not forget the public sector when we talk about the productivity challenge. At the moment, productivity is flatlining across the whole of our economy, and that's a phenomenon that we've seen across the developed world since the crisis. But we must challenge our public services to match the productivity growth performance over time of the private sector of our economy. Because if they do not, the logical consequence of that will be that if we want to maintain high-quality public services, we will see an increasing share of our gross national product having to be used in the delivery of public services. We need our public services to be as dynamic and as productive as the private sector of our economy. So, Iain, again, thank you for taking on this challenge, and I look forward to working with the CSJ over the months and years ahead to find the solutions that will power our economy forward.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. I'm now just going to ask Dr. Gerard Lyons to say a few words. He was on the panel that produced this report. So, Gerard?
Yeah. Well, good evening. It was a great pleasure to be on the panel. The list of the panellists on the working group is on page 4 to 5. And as Iain mentioned earlier, Andrew, one of the other working group members, is in the front row. I should actually stress that Patrick Spencer, who's here in the front row, was the fantastic researcher behind this, and he should be congratulated for putting together a great piece of work. I'd like to make just some general comments and then talk about what I think are the key takeaways, the 4 I's, as I call them, from this report. First general comment is that when we talk about productivity, it's important to remind ourselves why this is important. If productivity is higher in an economy, people can work less or be paid more, or both. Also, productivity drives an economy's output and its long-term potential, and in turn drives living standards. And everything shows that low productive economies find it hard to keep up with high productive economies. The Chancellor just touched on it in brief a moment ago, saying that this is a global problem since the financial crisis, where productivity has been low in the Western world. But it's important to stress, a month ago in his quarterly inflation report, the Governor of the Bank of England mentioned that since the financial crisis, the Bank of England has been continuously cutting its trend growth forecast for the UK from around 2.4% to something around 1.75%. And there's an expectation the OBR might cut trend growth forecast later this year. So this is a long-term problem. The second general comment is that this report is very data-rich, and it comes up with 51 recommendations. And I stress that because each of those recommendations, in their own way, is important. And it's important to stress that there is no magical solution to this productivity issue. So marginal improvements do make a difference. And therefore, I would congratulate the CSJ for coming up with so many specific issues rather than actually talking in broad terms. Also, the report on page 89 talks about the measurement issue. I get fed up, quite frankly, reading that France does in 4 days what we do in 5 days. France has a high youth unemployment problem. France has high productivity than us, but it has very high unemployment. America, likewise, has much higher productivity than us, but in America, a smaller proportion of the population is in employment than the UK. What this report highlights is the need to have not just higher productivity, but with employment and ideally with higher wages as well. That leads on to what I think are the 4 takeaways, the 4 I's. First, incentives. This report reiterates what is already out there in the literature, that we have a productivity gap across regions, and within sectors. Also, there's a long tail. So our best productive companies are really productive at a global level, but we have a long tail. Therefore, it's not just about top-down measures, it's also about bottom-up, and their incentives really do matter. For instance, in the report highlighting the need to get big firms incentivized to go into clusters across the country. The second I is inclusive. It highlights in the report the importance of inclusive productivity growth. Iain Duncan Smith touched on this at the very beginning. This report is a powerful reminder, and indeed timely reminder, that if you want to increase the income of the poorest, then you need to do that via productivity. It's quite interesting, maybe worrying, that the 5 least productive sectors of our economy, highlighted in this report, account for 1/3 of the economy's output and employ half the people in employment. Also, the productivity inclusive issue across the regions. Earlier this year, the European Commission, in their 3-year report of the most productive and competitive 263 regions across Europe, 3 of the top 5 are in the south of England. But even the European Commission, which is pretty impressive, 3 in the top 5 across the whole of Europe, but even the European Commission talked about Britain's heterogeneous grouping, i.e. the long tail. So inclusive productivity growth, not only at a regional level, but across the income strata. The third I is investment. Look, globally, we can try and compete on price or quality. I just returned from China yesterday, and quite frankly, even though they're moving up the value curve, if we just try and compete on price, someone somewhere will do it cheaper. Therefore, quality is really important. And the report really does highlight how little investment there is in general by UK firms, not just in physical capital, but in human capital. And alongside the importance of innovation, which comes out in this report, investment is key. And the final I is infrastructure. Hard, soft, and although it's not covered in this report, I would add institutional infrastructure as well. The hard infrastructure, physical infrastructure, is important to address the regional divide. The soft infrastructure issue, we don't always talk about in these terms, is about skills, education, and as the report stresses, vocational training. That's very important for helping the inclusive aspect. I would also add, given that the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown talked about the new institutional setup he would like between the Bank of England and the Treasury, the institutional infrastructure probably also needs to be addressed in future to address the groupthink status quo bias we often have. But to conclude, I think the 4 I's, incentives are highlighted by this report, inclusive productivity growth, investment is the 3rd I, and infrastructure, and I very much recommend this report, and I think it should be welcomed in the overall economic debate. Thank you.
Ronan?
Thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak here today. And thank you, Chancellor, for the challenge of looking at how we collectively find a way to close those productivity gaps right across British industry. It's also great to be here with the Living Wage Foundation. We've been proud members since 2014, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to Iain and Patrick for the great work they've done in putting out this report. It's, I think, a very important body of work that really underlines the challenge, but also has some practical recommendations around how we address that. Now, at Google, when we think of productivity, we probably look at it with 2 distinct lenses. I think the first one is our internal view of productivity. I'm proud of the fact that we are a very productive company, but that enables some key things for us. First and foremost, it's our innovation. It enables us to invest into developing great products that things like Gmail and search and so forth that have billions of users around the world. So innovation is the first thing that this productivity enables. The second one is our investment in our infrastructure, in our presence and in our staff. So we today have 5 offices in the UK. We're delighted that we confirmed at the turn of the year that we would be building a new one. We have also announced that we are expanding our workforce from 4,000 to 7,000 employees. And we expect that that investment will continue. And when you combine that internal productivity with the usage of our partners right across the UK of the platforms we create. So the second lens on productivity is that of our external view. We work with small businesses right across the UK. They make up the vast majority of our customer base. And those businesses use our platforms primarily to find ways to get the very best out of the web. And when they do, they find ways to grow their revenues, to grow their exports, and to grow their employee base. And they are usually doing that faster than their competitors who have yet to embrace digital technology. Together, we underpin a contribution to economic activity in the UK of up to £28 billion in a year, and that's around 500,000 jobs. But we're just one company supporting thousands of SMEs across the country. And when you stand back and look at the UK economy as a whole, we are today the #1 digital economy in the world, the #1 digital economy in the G20.
And when you look at the tech sector within that, it's growing at a phenomenal rate. It is outpacing other parts of the economy. It's adding jobs at about 50% greater rate. And today, last year, added about 85,000 new jobs and is supporting about 1.6 million jobs in the economy. And it's a thriving sector here in Manchester as well, supporting about 63,000 jobs in the local Manchester economy. But not every business across the UK gets to feel the power of technology, gets to feel the power of what the web can produce. And we recognised this a number of years ago and put in place a programme called the Digital Garage. Today it's travelled around a couple of hundred towns and cities across the UK, and it's focused on bringing the best of digital skills to individuals and businesses right across the UK. We've continued to grow and expand the impact of this programme. At the moment, we're training over 2,000 people and businesses every week. And the impact that that training has is quite transformative. I'd like to tell you the story about a chap called Adam I met recently when we opened up the second digital garage in Birmingham, a location on Main Street in Birmingham. And Adam, who had attended our first one, and at the time ran a small barbershop called Barberology, having gone through the digital training, he found the skills that he needed to set up a simple website, but used that to grow his customer base. And within a very short period of time, had doubled his customer base, grown his profits by 30%, and given him a way to be able to go and grow his small business into now multiple shops and growing his employment base. And I think this is a story that you'll hear from many, many of the businesses who've had access to these skills for the very first time. And if you're out there struggling to build a small business, very often it's daunting to try and get access to those skills. So I was very happy to see one of the pieces within the report that was underlined was the focus on human capital. And I think the government has a great opportunity to supercharge the focus on human capital through its digital skills partnership, and we look forward to being able to contribute to that story into the future. One of the areas where we think it's important is around digital skills. We think it's important also to focus on lifelong learning, but also to look at ways in which we can continue to develop the secondary education, further education and higher education institutions, because the challenges that we will see over the next 5 or 10 years will continue to evolve at a fairly rapid pace. Ourselves, we continue to focus on this area. We're doing a lot of work with the ADA College, the National College for Digital Skills, where we've developed an apprentice program to try and take people from a very diverse set of backgrounds and bring them into the engineering field. We've traditionally gone out and focused on computer science graduates of colleges around the country and overseas, but we're now developing new ways to be able to take great talent from very diverse aspects of society and bring them into these really important jobs, which will be a significant driver of growth over the coming years. So although we're an American company, and you may have detected I have an Irish accent, we still feel we're very much a British company as well. And we're very proud to be part of the story of growth in the UK's digital economy, and we look forward to being part of the growth of many of the small businesses that will continue to look for ways to get the very best out of the web in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Before I go to Katherine, I'm going to have a chance to go because he's due at another place to do some speaking. So good luck tomorrow, and thank you very much for coming. So, Katherine of the Living Wage Foundation, Katherine Chapman, like to say a word.
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here, and thank you again to CSJ and everyone for writing reports and inviting us on this event today. For those who don't know, the Living Wage Foundation, we're the organisation at the heart of the living wage movement in the UK, and we've been campaigning really for the last 15, 16 years for a higher wage that's based on the cost of living. The Living Wage Foundation, we work with businesses who pay the higher rates, which are £9.75 is the London living wage, and £8.45 is the UK living wage, and it's the only rate that's independently calculated based on the cost of living. We now work with over nearly 3,500 businesses across the UK who are choosing to pay these higher rates. It's become kind of a badge, like a fair trademark for responsible pay. Names like Google, Aviva, a third of the FTSE 100, but also thousands of small employers and companies like IKEA who have workforces in a lot of these low-pay sectors. Now, the reason this matters, and this matters in the context of this report, is that pay and productivity do go hand in hand. Thinking about pay and decent conditions for workers, particularly in that lowest 20%, which this report talks about, is really a part of this productivity puzzle. And we were delighted to see in the report and really welcome this focus on the lowest 20% and what that means for jobs and productivity, and the focus on human capital is an important dimension of this debate. And just to kind of bring that home, I'll just use an example really about why this matters. Lynn Hannah is a cleaner at Aviva in her Norwich offices. She's worked there for years. When Aviva rolled out the living wage in 2014 across all their UK sites, it made a huge impact on her life. She's in her 60s, with her and her husband have the primary care for their granddaughter. And the difference that the living wage made, and this was about £1 an hour extra than the minimum wage, meant that instead of struggling at the end of every month, she was able to put just that little bit aside, and that meant that she was able to sometimes say yes when her granddaughter asked for a trip to McDonald's. She was able to save up over time to buy a laptop so that she could help her daughter with her homework. And she also meant that when working at Aviva, she felt proud, she felt committed to Aviva, and she wanted to stay working there. She felt part of the team. Now, I know since then that Lynn has since gone on and had a promotion, and so again, it's that point about in-work progression, and she has a future and a career at Aviva. So it makes a huge difference to people's lives, but it also has a real impact on the businesses. So we have nearly 3,500 signed up, and they are doing this because it's the right thing to do, but increasingly they're also seeing it because they want to treat their workforce as an investment, and it makes a real difference to the bottom line and to productivity. So to give you another example, probably many of you will have heard of Brewdog, the beer company. They signed up as a living wage employer a couple of years ago, and they, as well as brewing beer, they have about 45, 50 bars across the country, so retail sites. So a lot of their employees were impacted when they moved to the living wage, and this is a sector where you see lots of low pay and low productivity. When they moved to the living wage, they saw that their staff retention increased hugely. So staff turnover dropped by, on average, 40% across all their retail sites, which is a huge saving. They also invested in staff management when they introduced the living wage, so looking at it holistically, and they reduced their use of zero-hours contracts. In fact, they abolished them. So the combination of introducing more secure work, higher pay, and investing in training had these huge impacts on recruitment and retention, and they also found that internal promotions to management increased from kind of 40 to 60% to 80%. So I suppose the point that I'd really like to emphasise, and I think is a really important part of the debate, and it's great that it's part of this report, is that that focus on pay, on decent work, and employee and employer responsible employment practices is a key part of the productivity puzzle. And until we get that right, we're probably never going to solve it in the long run. So we really welcome the findings in this report, particularly around the Good Employer Manifesto, and the recommendations around employment practices, and we look forward to working with the CSJ to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. So I'm going to open this up to questions, but just before I do, I just want to highlight two things and make one thank you. The highlighted area was to do with, there are 51 recommendations, I think, in this report. I'm glad I got that figure right. And recommendation 29 is one that gets very little coverage. And the reason is it's about broadening the choice in schools using FE and also apprenticeship work. And one of the things we really dug into was the real gap between what schools will talk about to parents, what parents themselves have as expectations, and hugely what teachers themselves think of things like apprenticeships and the use of FE colleges for more vocational work. This is a huge area, and this is not a problem faced in places like Germany or even in the States. So it's one of the areas that you can make huge progress on to get people better skilled even before they go. And the second point was, following on from Katherine, was that when I was at the Department of Work and Pensions, we asked the contracting company to pay the London living wage to its cleaners. And then followed a really interesting debate with them about how this would immediately leave us short of staff because they had to lay people off. If that was the case, it would mean that fewer people worked in the building, etc. But we did insist that they paid it, and eventually they paid it, agreed to do it. And about 3 months later, I remember meeting a delegation of people who had been cleaners, and they all said to me, no one has been laid off because we no longer rush from one building to another to try and get extra money from the other businesses. What we do is we do a longer and better job in this building. It's got so much better in here now that the company has been able to keep us, and therefore they've progressed, their income have progressed, and the company's quality of service actually progressed. So I only simply make that because sometimes we don't really think about that. And the last one is a thank you again to Patrick, who did a huge amount of the work in this, and particularly was very good in highlighting some of those educational problems, and has been niggling me quite rightly to keep on referencing that. So my thanks particularly, Patrick, to you for the hard work that you put in. And now open to questions. And if you could identify yourselves who you are, and then we will direct the question to somebody first. I'll start at the front. I have to, because Andrew is on the panel. Andrew.
Andrew Churchill from the JJ Church. Thank you. I had the fortune to be part of your panel. I'd like to draw two threads together. First, the thread on apprenticeship, and second, Katherine's point on living wage. I think it's incredibly important when we're talking to schools and we're talking to potential apprentices of the future, particularly in the age of the apprenticeship levy, that we think about the apprenticeship minimum wage as well. I pay my apprentices, and I'm not a stupid businessman, but I pay them 300% of the apprentice minimum wage. If you pay an apprentice the minimum wage, you're telling them they're not a valued member of your team. They have an enormous step when they've finished the 4 years as apprenticeship, but in the 4 years up to that point, they've struggled to pay for fuel to get to work. It costs me about £80,000 to invest in an apprenticeship. Why on earth wouldn't I pay them a living wage so I keep them thereafter? And I'd like the employers in the room to think about this, because I think this is another bit that's hidden, and it's another part of our future as we automate, as we digitise, that we need to look after and nurture.
Andrew, of course, runs his own aerospace company, so very much at the high-end technology. Did anybody want to comment on that or not really?
Only that he's put it perfectly, so...
Very good. I've got a gentleman at the back, so microphone just there, if I could.
Hello.
Can you identify yourself?
My name is Eric Holford. I'm a councillor on South Lanarkshire Council. I'm also an employer. We are, both the council and myself, we're both living wage employers. What I was thinking was, the real problem that we have with productivity, as far as I can see, is that we have a very productive southeast and we have a rather less productive rest of the country. And it's important that we see investment in and devolution of investment to the rest of the country. So I was very pleased to see, unfortunately he's gone, the Chancellor up in Aberdeen the other day, investing money in the oil industry, which might seem an odd thing, but also in trying to develop a hub for decommissioning of the oil industry. So I thought that was very good, very well done. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, right. That wasn't a question, it's a statement, so I'll come back to somebody who might have a go. I'll come back over here, then I'll come over to the right. So, gentleman there with glasses. Just if you'd all identify yourselves, because even though I know you, I think it's important you let everybody
I'm Paul Newman. I work for a financial services company in the city, a company called Next Limited, Next Group. I have a question, I think probably for Dr. Lyons. It's a question, IDS drew our attention very quickly to that chart on page 18. And I think he mentioned something about the salary differentials in different parts of the region, which of course looks striking on the chart. In fact, I think I'd read something Patrick Spencer published elsewhere yesterday on this. But my question is this. I mean, surely 'twas ever thus. I mean, it was always the case that London was very different elsewhere. Indeed, it is still obviously the case elsewhere. Washington and New York compared to Alabama, Paris compared to, the Tour area or Le Mans. So I don't see that, obviously it's a different issue to the issue of productivity, but I'm wondering why we think of that as so important. And of course, obviously, even though wages are, 25% lower elsewhere, clearly the cost of living is similarly lower.
The question basically from Paul, in case people didn't hear it at the end, was why should we be surprised that London's more productive than the rest of the country? And number of points come out from this. First and foremost, as indeed the Chancellor touched on, not just in his earlier comments, but as a main part of his speech last year, I think it was in Birmingham, about the productivity gap between London and other cities. It's not uncommon for a capital city to dominate and to have a big productivity gap between the capital and the second city. The challenge in the UK is that productivity gap is bigger in the UK between London and other cities, partly because London has a global financial centre, but nonetheless it's an issue. It's also really going to become a big problem in the future. More and more of global growth is coming from cities, and this is a challenge as well as an opportunity. In fact, half of global growth at the moment comes from the top 600 cities in the world, of which 157 are in the West. In 20 years' time, most economists or the forecasts suggest that top 600 cities in the world will account for 2/3 of global growth, but by then only 20 will be in the West. So we've got a challenge in terms of new mid-tier cities coming along. London is going to be the only city in the UK that's globally competitive in most people's forecasts in 20 years' time. So we really need to empower the mid-tier cities across the UK. And the way to do that, as this report touches on, is about enabling the private sector, to incentivise the private sector to go to those other regions, to boost them up. And also, in terms of this graph that Iain touched on page 18, some people would point out government spending. If you look at, even before the coalition agreed their deal on the extra £1 billion, in terms of spending per person, the top regions in terms of spending per person, government spending, are number 1, Northern Ireland, number 2, Scotland, number 3, London, and then number 4, Wales. The bottom, the region that gets the lowest spending per person is the South East. London and the South East always gets clubbed together, but the South East gets lower spending per person, then the East of England, and then East Midlands. So some people might argue, coming back to your question, it's not an issue that we should be surprised by this, but it's about the gap between London and the rest, and it's about making sure we don't pull London back, but we put everything else in place to boost the other parts of the country.
Thank you. Lady over there, and then I'll come back round. Microphone?
Hello, Mary O'Shaughnessy. I'm a consultant and also a mature student at London Met. And going back to the apprenticeship issue, is I work within the regulation services. And the biggest issue is where local government and local authorities want a contractor to do apprenticeships, but don't want to put it into the tender bids. And I think if it was made compulsory that a certain amount of apprentices were taken through, more companies would do it, because I've seen it where young people are so productive because they take such a pride in their work, but it's down to the goodwill of the contractor to see if they'll be doing it. By putting a more level playing field in there, hopefully once they start, then they'll go forward.
Who would like to have a go at that question? Katherine.
I'd just make the point that in the living wage accreditation, a crucial part of why it's been successful is because it does include on-site contractors. So it's using that power of the supply chain and procurement to spread best practice, and it's worked really well in that context. So I would just really encourage public procurement is a really powerful tool in this to promote good practice. It's worked for the Living Wage campaign, and I'm sure it can work in this context. So I think there's a recommendation about 36 about government's role here, and I think the public sector does have a leadership role to play here in using their purchasing power that is significant to make sure that people can have decent work, apprentices, all those things. So I just think that's a really powerful part of this debate.
Gerard, you want to say a quick word?
Well, I agree with what Katherine just said, but Mary, coming back to your question, the report itself highlights, in terms of the context of your question, vocational training, and it's the supply as well. One could say, more generally, we might be sending too many people to university compared to people to vocational training, and it's about giving vocational training the importance and the credibility that it really deserves.
Gentleman here has another question.
Hello, Daniel Taylor. I'm from Norwich Conservatives. First event I've come to, and I've really enjoyed it, so thank you very much. I was wondering, do you think there's a possibility that we might possibly get to terminal velocity in terms of productivity within certain sectors? I'm thinking in particular within the care sector, given the fact we've got increasing life expectancy, and obviously people are living longer, we're going to have to pay for more carers to care for the elderly population. Given the fact that turnover is so high among care staff already, to pay them the living wage, do you feel that we're ultimately going to be in a vicious cycle where if we just keep on paying people or upping the rate they're paid, it's not actually going to accomplish anything because the turnover will still be high and there still won't be enough people performing care for the elderly population?
Actually, thanks, Kevin, for the question. Do I think we'll reach terminal productivity? Possibly, but my answer would be no. Interesting for everyone else in the audience, the care sector is one of those 5 least productive sectors in the economy. And one of the challenges with productivity is that if you pay people more, then that would suggest productivity goes up. So but we need to make sure that the measurement issue, as the report highlights on, is as much about not just the input of the people improving that, but also the output, the quality of it. But I say no because Japan is quite interesting. Japan has a rapidly aging population and is at the forefront of robotics, basically bringing technology to enhance the productivity of people, particularly in the old age sector. I don't think they call it the care sector in Japan. So we need to not only play to our strengths in the UK, but almost adopt best practice from elsewhere. And when one looks at productivity, it often has sort of stepwise function. That is, something happens, it improves it a lot, then it trends, then it improves it again. So I think we need to not only improve the skills of people in the sector, as the report mentions, but also the technology, the innovation side as well. Thank you.
We had a couple of questions over here. We get the microphone over here. I'm trying to get around as quick as I can. I'm going to take in clusters of 2, if I can, please, because that might speed things up a bit. So we'll take this gentleman here, and there was somebody nearby.
Phil Hall from the Association of Accounting Technicians. We have about 140,000 members. Most of them work for or run their own SME. When we surveyed them on the issue of pay, 70% said they wanted to see the existing minimum wage.
Sorry, we lost that, didn't we? That was the minimum wage, and then the critical word was... Can you try it again? Let's just see if it's... Okay, try it.
Wanted to see the existing minimum wage structure.
Abolish. We keep missing that word. Just in case
abolish
anybody missed
and
it.
replace with a living wage foundation wages instead. And my second quick point is about measurement, and Ireland, I understand, are looking at changing the way in which they measure productivity to take into account the creative sector and the tech sector, which of course we are world leaders in. And if we did the same, then our GDP statistics would be about 5 or 6% higher than they actually are. So could you expand on the issue of measurement?
If you could pass the microphone down, you've got another gentleman there, and if you could just ask your question.
Hello, I'm James. I am actually an apprentice from Ipswich in the east of England. So my question was, what would be your response to somebody who says that the living wage may be inflationary, which I've heard quite a lot of people say? And another part was, what do you think the government can do to support very small businesses? I think of my brother who employs 3 people, and I think he would struggle to pay the living wage being such a small business. So what do you think the government can do to support people in that situation?
Okay, 2 very, very interesting questions. I suspect all the panellists would have a go at this. Who'd like to start? Katherine?
Okay. So on the point about the living wage and the minimum wage, we'd obviously like to see as many employees as possible earning a cost of living wage. It is an inflationary measure because the principle of the living wage is it's based on what it costs to live. So it's a needs-based calculation, which means it will go up every year as the prices of those goods and services go up. But in turn, what that means is that people, particularly on those lowest incomes, are protected from those increased costs in terms of their living standards, and we know that inflation hits those on lowest incomes hardest. But in terms of the SME point, 85% of our accredited living wage employers are small businesses. So that's thousands, and perhaps can seem counterintuitive in some ways. But actually, I think this is because a lot of small businesses, as much as anyone or more than anyone, recognise the real value of their workforce in delivering their businesses. They want their employees to feel part of their business. They know that their effectiveness relies on their employees. So we actually find that the small businesses we work with are some of our strongest champions. And there was some research done recently that talked about the business benefits of the living wage, particularly for SMEs, conducted by Liverpool University in Middlesex. And if I just might make a point about the social care point on living wage, social care is a crucial job in our society, and there is a fairness point here that people going out, caring for our elderly, caring for those most vulnerable in our society, should be able to earn a wage they can live on. And part of the reason that retention and turnover is so high is because the jobs are so difficult and the pay probably doesn't reflect what's needed. So I think that's also part of the answer and part of the solution. I think us as a society need to find a way to be able to reward those care workers in a way that means that the job is meaningful and productive.
Very good. Ronan, do you want to come in on
Yeah,
this?
absolutely. So I think the point around SMEs and the living wage being inflationary, I think when we talk about the topic of productivity, we need to look at how we drive the productivity of companies forward, as well as bringing everybody up to the living wage point. What we've seen, and I mentioned this earlier on, is when you enable businesses, no matter their size or their industry, with the best of digital technologies that exist today, that they outstrip in terms of growth, in terms of job creation, their peers and their competitors. So I think the government also has a very important job to do to make sure people are getting access to the resources they need to invest in the human capital within their businesses, to be able to drive their own productivity forward, and then hopefully what follows is an increase in their own return on investment, and the living wage question becomes not such a big question of just pure inflation, but supporting the innovation that they're driving within their business.
Joe, do you want to say a quick word on this?
Yeah,
and then we'll
quick
move.
word. Actually, Phil, in his first question, also touched about measurement. And again, this is work in progress, because the cultural creative sector are getting productivity measured properly in those sectors. And indeed, this is an issue for the UK. The UK is so different to the rest of Europe, where 3/4 of our economy is services. And many economic measures are more geared to manufacturing sectors. So again, it is good that this report has tried to address that issue, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. James's point, when I worked at City Hall, I championed the living wage, and I think he touches on the key thing. And this is why I personally think the living wage should be voluntary, because there is a big difference between small, medium-sized firms and big companies. But I think that Katherine's point about consumers championing it, because living wage companies receive a badge of honour, and then it incentivises the companies themselves to actually want to adopt the living wage as well.
Okay, I can take 3 questions, because I think we're getting close to finish. I might, if you're really quick, take 4, all in a cluster. So who was that first? Gentleman at the back, I think. Just there.
Thank you. Good evening. Clive Whittaker, Hampstead in Kilburn. 2 quick questions, one for Ronan and one for everyone else. The one for everyone else is, it seems to me that there are 2 types of measure which can be brought to bear here. There's what you might call the kind of pull measure, which is better education, better skills, better infrastructure, transport, less bureaucracy, and so forth. And there's what you might call push measures, which is immigration controls, which is the living wage, and so forth. If you could only have one of those 2 classes of measure, which would be the class that you would choose? And Ronan, I'd just be very interested to know your perspective from
I'm going to ask you
the
to
experience.
Because we've got
The experience you have around the world. Is there, we've said about productivity being a Western problem generally. Is there anything that you see that typifies the British experience, which makes it different to the other countries and markets that you have experience of?
Okay, very quickly, because she's had her hand up for ages, the lady just there, and then I'm going to have to come over here, because the gentleman here wants one, and...
Hi,
okay,
thank you.
There.
Jessica Northend from the John Lewis Partnership. My chairman, Sir Charlie Mayfield, has been doing lots of work with other senior business leaders around how businesses can actually work together to improve firm-level productivity, and it was something that the Chancellor supported through the last autumn statement. We've talked a lot about the long tail of productivity challenge in the UK, and Ronan, you've talked about Google's work with SMEs. I just wonder, what single ask would you have of businesses in this room to help improve their productivity and that of their supply chain? One thing we could take away today.
Very good. That's one for you in a second, Ronan. Over here, gentleman here, and then very quickly, there's a lady over here on the left, and I'm going to have to, at that point.
Good evening, Edward Carpenter from Rochdale, which is struggling with very low levels of productivity at the moment. Iain, I, like you, am an ex-member of the Armed Forces, and I think we have a few other ex-members of the Armed Forces here. The Armed Forces put a really explicit focus on leadership. I see leadership as having the responsibility to forge a collective vision and then drive the ambition and determination to drive forward the realisation of that vision. I think devolution gives leaders the space to breathe and succeed, but does the panel think that greater levels of ambitious leadership has a role to play in increasing productivity? And if so, how should that greater level of leadership at the regional and local level be encouraged?
And very quickly over to the lady here, and then we'll try and get everyone to be brief. In the middle, just at the back.
Mine is just a couple of comments.
Well, you give them to while we're going to the other lady. Okay. Yeah, go on quickly.
Okay, so Dr. Ali from Tower Hamlets. I'm a GP and I'm in the care sector. First of all, we've got to be really careful that we should recognise apprentices. They're not second-class workers. They have the same living costs, and they actually add. My surgery, my practice, and Tower Hamlets was very reluctant to take on an apprentice. Proved one of the best things that we did. So please, we must avoid that. They have the same living cost. They're innovative. They are our future generation, our future workforce. We mustn't create a second-class sector. Also from Local Mobile, where we employ 7,000 people, I'm always keen to make sure. I'm not wearing red vest today.
Take the microphone. It's the lady at the back. Who's had her hand up for a long time.
Just on enterprise zones, very interested to see your recommendation to increase them. Sorry, I'm Siobhan from Camden Council. Interested to know what ministers' responses have been and discussions about increasing them and whether they have been looked at to be used in areas with pressured immigrations. I've been sat in lots of discussions about how we deal with integration post-Brexit. So,
very good. Right. Who wants to start with Ronan? You kick off and then the others can follow.
Great. So I'm going to address two questions. The first one from Clive, asking me what, if anything, I'd seen from anywhere else around the world in terms of productivity and or skills. I think the point I would highlight is the one around skills, and particularly STEM skills in secondary, further and higher education. In the Nordic countries and also in parts of Southeast Asia, I see that governments have really focused very intensely on driving the levels forward within their population at large and investing heavily in these areas. Moving on to the question from Jessica, I think it was the question of what can businesses do today to try and drive their productivity. I'll give two quite perhaps simple answers. I attended Sir Charlie Mayfield's and his group's launch around how to drive productivity in the UK. I would strongly commend any small and medium enterprise to go to the website, bethebusiness.com, to take the simple tests that are on that site about measuring their own productivity and where they can get help and what are the aspects they can drive. The second area that I would certainly call attention to is the power of the web today. And if, as a business, you are not sitting down and thinking about how you get the very best out of the web to grow your revenues nationally within the UK, your exports across borders, you probably are leaving opportunity on the table to drive your productivity forward. So there are two things I would commend to any business.
Katherine, do you want to pick up next?
Yep, on the pull and push measure point, we found that when our employers have adopted the living wage, it's had the best impacts both on employees and the productivity of the business when they've combined the two, if that makes sense. And by that I mean they've looked at paying the living wage alongside a range of other practices, and they've thought in the long term about how their business models work and what kind of business they want to be. And when it's done in the right way like that, the living wage is a pull measure as much as a push measure, and that's when you get the best results. Jessica's point about one thing, obviously I would say look at your pay and employment practices, and until you've kind of got that right as a basics as a business and seeing staff as an investment perhaps rather than a cost, then from there you can start thinking about productivity. And finally, on the point about a greater level of leadership and ambition from businesses, the businesses we work with have strong visions of the kind of productive nation they want to see, fair nation, fair businesses. And I just totally agree that a key part of that is about being a responsible business and defining what kind of economy we want to be with decent wages, high-level skills, high productivity.
Gerard.
Yeah, well, I think we would all agree with the lady in the middle about apprenticeships, etc. The gentleman from Rochdale, in addition to about leadership, I think it's the fact that everyone knows what is expected of them. That's the real benefit of clear leadership, not just the vision for the company, but it does, all the data shows that improves productivity at a local level. The lady at the back, in terms of the feedback about enterprise zones, I think the key thing about the report was, as you touch on, the fact it came up with so many good recommendations regarding clusters. And Iain would probably know better in terms of the feedback. The very fact that the Chancellor's here today, or was here today, I think shows that it's gone down well. But the final question, Jessica, what should business leaders do? I would say read this report.
Very good. Well, thank you for that last one. I'm going to wrap this all up by simply saying that I think this is one of the best reports that the CSJ has produced. In no small measure, thanks, as I said earlier on, to the incredibly hard work of the Secretariat and the body of Patrick Spencer, but also by the whole team. And there are many other people who were on that panel and some who aren't able to be here, and I will just raise a couple of names here. Sir Iain Cheshire was also part of that. John Mills, who's being both a manufacturer and also a catalogue man. Dr. Sarah Main, Carol Willis, all were part of that, all bringing a level of expertise and interest to this, which makes this report, I think, really rather startling. And one small fact, which is we do, whilst this raises real issues about our productivity, one small point that was discovered was that we do, as Gerard said earlier on, beat ourselves up a bit on some of these international comparisons when there is no international measure of what productivity is. And we did notice that France somehow manages to lose its public sector productivity figures in its overall calculation of productivity. I say nothing more about France other than this must have been a mistake somewhere along the line, because we end up comparing all of ours with their private sector productivity, which, as you can probably see, is a little bit unfair. But the very important point that was made earlier on is that we should not try and achieve productivity by getting rid of people out of work. If you compare ourselves to Europe, the high levels of youth unemployment and unemployment generally are not where we want to be. We want to have high productivity, but also high employment. And the two can go together. And our level of employment today is at a high level. Our level of activity amongst the working age is at the highest level it's ever been. These are features that are success stories for the UK. They're things to build on, and that building on has got to look at those minimum wage. And the last point I make about this is, you know, all of this affects the worst off in society, and that's the whole point about the Centre for Social Justice. We were set up to look at those in the lowest income groups. How do we help them to improve their level and quality of life through education and through now, in this case, productivity, but also about family breakdown, you know, generally failed education, debt, addictions to drugs and alcohol, and of course, finally, worklessness. And all of those are, in a sense, picked up in this paper. So thank you all for being here. I hope this won't be the last time you get involved with the Centre for Social Justice. We are on a mission, and I'm going to say unashamedly to the Conservatives in this room, and of which I hope there are a large number, I simply say we have slightly lost the narrative on this. It should be right and centre in our DNA as Conservatives that we care about the people in the lowest income groups, regardless of who they vote for. And that is why we set out on this report, and that is why we are unashamedly, through the course of this conference, picking up many issues that others won't. Our message out there has to be, through a strong economy, if we care about those in the lowest income groups, we can change their lives by being on their side. That is what the CSJ is about. It should be what, in my concern, is generally about the Conservative Party. We have some years to make sure we get that right and get that message out. That's what this report is, just one of a number that we do. Thank you very much indeed for being here.